Well, good afternoon and good morning, depending on where you're at. My name is Kyle Kondik. I'm the managing editor of Sabatos Crystal Ball at the University of Virginia Center for Politics. We have a great panel today on the Veepstakes, who Joe Biden might select as his running mate, whether Donald Trump might consider a new running mate, the historical importance of the vice presidential choice. There's a kind of amusing quote that may or may not be apocryphal attached to the vice presidential office, and that was John Nance Garner, former holder of the vice presidential office, said that it was, quote, not worth a bucket of warm spit. Although I think given how many people are angling for the position these days, I don't think that's generally the feeling on it, and the office has evolved over time. But let me introduce our fabulous panel here, and then we'll just get into it. And I also want to thank all of the Crystal Ball readers who sent us questions. We're not going to get to all of them, but we're hoping to get to some of them. So, and many of them are very good. So I'm looking forward to that. So let me start here by introducing our panelists. Julia Azari is a professor of political science at Marquette University. She is a pretty frequent political commentator. Her work is appeared at 538 and also the Mischiefs of Faction, a great political blog. She also co-hosts the Politics in Question podcast. Julia, welcome.
Thanks.
David Byler, an analyst and political columnist at the Washington Post. He focuses on elections, polling, demographics, and statistics. Most recently, he's been writing a lot of columns sort of assessing the assets of the various vice presidential choices for Joe Biden. So, David, welcome.
Thanks.
We've got Joel Goldstein, who is one of the nation's leading experts on the vice presidency. He's a historian and author. His most recent book is The White House Vice Presidency, The Path to Significance, Mondale to Biden. He is our resident expert on the vice presidency at the Sabatos Crystal Ball. And he's also the emeritus Vincent C. Immel Professor of Law at St. Louis University. Joel, welcome.
Thanks, Carl.
Finally, we've got Ted Johnson, who's Senior Fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice. His work explores the role that race plays in electoral politics, issue framing, and disparities in policy outcomes. I was fortunate enough to be able to join Ted's class a few months ago and had a great time. So thanks for returning the favor and joining us.
Thank you.
So let's just jump right in here, and I want to make sure we get everyone involved here. So I've got a specific question I want to address to all four panelists. I'm going to start with Joel. And Joel, just how important historically is the VP selection, and also how has the office changed over time? I mentioned that kind of derogatory quote from John Nance Garner about the office, and maybe that's not how folks feel about it anymore.
Well, I think the selection is very important, both politically and in terms of governance. And I think that's why presidential candidates and their teams spend a lot of time on it. It's something of a myth that the vice presidential selection doesn't make much of a difference. I think that's in part because presidential candidates spend so much time on it that they, generally speaking, do a pretty good job of picking people who are pretty plausible presidents, and that tends to somewhat to minimize the impact it makes. But it's also because of how we look at making a difference. It's true that who Vice President Biden chooses as his running mate isn't going to swing huge percentages of votes. But then, in all likelihood, nothing that happens during the campaign is going to swing massive amounts of votes. We're talking about making a difference at the margins. And if we look at the elections since 1960, roughly 40% of them have been decided at the margins. I think it's very plausible that the vice presidential choice made a difference in 1960 and 1976, and in different ways in 1992 and in 2000, perhaps some other times. It's not that people aren't going to say that I hate Joe Biden, but I love who he picks for his running mate, and therefore I'm going to vote for the Democratic ticket. But whoever Vice President Biden chooses will send messages about how he makes decisions, what he values, what sort of leader he is. And he'll also be handing a particular candidate a large megaphone where there'll be a center of focus during the campaign, and they'll have a chance, based on their campaigning ability, to make a difference in terms of accentuating certain themes or ideas during the campaign. It makes a difference in terms of governing, because the importance of the vice presidency now isn't just that that 20% of our presidents started out as were vice presidents who succeeded, or that the vice presidency is the best springboard, but that being vice president matters, that the vice president's an integral part of the presidency, part of the president's inner circle. Ever since the Carter administration, that's been the case. And I think that's something that Joe Biden understands more than most of us do, that the presidency is too big for one person, and that if you have a vice president who can help you as an advisor and troubleshooter, it makes a big difference. So I think it matters in both ways a great deal.
Julia, next question to you. There's really only the basic constitutional presidential eligibility requirements for the person to be picked for vice president. Although Joe Biden has made another limitation, I guess, in the sense that he said he's going to select a woman to be his running mate. You've written about how in some previous VP choices that maybe there were some candidates that a presidential nominee maybe wanted to choose and kind of was pushed out of doing that. And I'm wondering, as you look at Biden's choice, do you think that there are practical limitations on who he might be able to choose? How do other people in the party kind of impact the decision that Biden may ultimately end up making?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that based on the research that I've done with my colleague, William Adler, we've kind of found that this tends to play out ideologically. And that our working hypothesis is that parties tend to have a kind of ideological picture of what they want the ticket to look like. That varies a little bit across the two parties, with Democrats tending to want to balance the ticket to the center, and Republicans wanting to balance it to the right. But in both cases, it's this kind of vision of building out the party through the ticket, and that candidates themselves may want to kind of consolidate their ideological project. I think that plays out a little bit differently with Biden, because it's not totally obvious to me that he has an ideological project, right? He's obviously not coming from the Sanders wing of the party, or even 1992, as Joel already mentioned, is kind of an interesting year for vice presidential selection. Clinton, I think, really did make a statement about his stance as a new Democrat, a third way centrist Democrat, in his selection of Al Gore, who came from that same wing of the party. And we won't know if there's pressure being exerted on Biden, either from the party to incorporate the progressive left, which may be a lesson from 2016, as in a failure to do so that year, or on the other hand, pressure from the party not to move too far left so as not to alienate the mythical moderate swing voters.
Ted, you wrote a column a couple months ago in which you advocated that the Democratic nominee should consider an African-American running mate. What do you think? What was your case for that? And also, do you think that if in fact choosing an African-American running mate would provide some assets to the campaign, would you say the same thing if, say, Biden chose someone, a Hispanic American, for instance, for the slot?
Yeah, so the bottom line of this argument is turnout. And if elections are won based on which party is better at turning out their supporters, history has shown us over the last 5-6 decades that the Democratic Party can count on Black voters to give them 90% of their vote in congressional and presidential elections almost without fail. And that number is even higher, upwards of 94, 95% in the last few elections. So if the election is going to be determined on that score, then a Black candidate, a Black Democratic candidate, is one of the most tried and true ways to help increase Black turnout. Now, we know in 2016, Black turnout dropped 7 points from where it was in 2012 for some obvious reasons. One, Hillary Clinton wasn't Barack Obama. There wasn't a Black guy on the ticket. And we also know that we've never had a Black vice presidential candidate. So it's hard to sort of make the case that just having a Black person on the ticket will increase Black turnout to the point where it may change the election. But what we can do is look to see how Black voters have behaved in mayoral elections, congressional elections, gubernatorial elections, and we can look at the campaigns that Jesse Jackson had in '84 and '88, Barack Obama in '8 and '12, to see the impacts that a Black candidate on a Democratic ticket has on Black voter turnout. So, and what political science has certainly found out is that for Black Democratic candidates running, Black voter turnout increases in those congressional districts where Black voters are the majority or a large presence, and when they are represented by Black elected officials at the congressional or at state sort of legislative or executive levels. So what this means, in 2016, when Hillary Clinton loses Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan by about 80,000 votes, each of those states have high concentration population areas of Black voters in Milwaukee, Detroit, and Philadelphia that are all represented by Black elected officials. And so if a Black vice presidential candidate reaps the benefits that other Black elected officials have in other elections, then we could expect those particular cities to increase in turnout. Black turnout going from 59.5%, where it was in 2016, up to about 62 or 63, would probably swing a few states, and maybe even not just the three that I mentioned, but maybe even Florida or North Carolina. So that's the argument for why a Black presidential candidate or a Black vice presidential candidate would be advantageous. A couple of quick things here. One is they're not plug and play. So Stacey Abrams is not Val Demings, is not Kamala Harris. So being Black ain't enough. You got to do more than that. And so the Biden campaign, if they go this route, will have to be very strategic in who they choose. The other thing, Black voting behavior, as I mentioned, is quite distinct, maybe the most distinct political phenomenon in American politics today. So you do not see the linked fate, the uniformity within other electorates that you see within the Black electorate. So Hispanics, that's sort of a catch-all category that talks about Americans of Cuban descent and of Mexican descent and of Guatemalan. They don't have the same shared experiences or common set of politics in the way that African Americans do, given our shared history in the United States. So that uniformity in voting you don't see among Hispanics, and that's borne itself out in recent elections. That also doesn't apply to Asian Americans, this category that includes Japanese, Americans of Japanese descent, Americans of Chinese descent, Korean, and Indian. Again, another catch-all category without the same set of experiences. So this is what makes Black voting behavior a unique thing. And it is that uniqueness that I think the Democrats would benefit from if they were to choose a Black vice presidential candidate in terms of turnout.
David, as I mentioned, you've been writing a lot of pieces for the Washington Post, kind of almost making the case for certain Democratic running mates. You've talked about Kamala Harris, Amy Klobuchar, Tammy Baldwin, Tammy Duckworth, Elizabeth Warren, and Val Demings. So you haven't hit all the big names, but many of them. As you've been writing these pieces, do you think that the case for any one or two of these candidates maybe stands out as maybe the best choice for Biden? And you know, how have you kind of thought about your own efforts to kind of make the best case for these candidates?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There are a few that I think stand out amongst that group, but one of sort of the macro lessons of this exercise and argumentation where I try to get inside the mind of sort of a super fan for each of these vice presidential candidates and try to make the best case from. One of the sort of macro lessons is that this is hard to optimize. And you can pick two totally different reasonable sets of criteria and come up with this person is the best vice presidential choice or this person is. An example that comes to mind immediately, I think that the case for Klobuchar is a really strong one because she's basically exactly in step with the Biden message. And if you look at head-to-head polls, that message is clearly working. On the other hand, if you look at it from an electoral map perspective, who is likely to get maybe even some small home state bonus in one of the states that matters, then Tammy Baldwin seems like the right choice. And so you can go through and you can look at these different candidates under different criteria. But if I had to pick a few that stood out, I thought that Klobuchar, it's very easy to make the case for her because she's so sort of in step with Biden ideologically. I think Biden and people, I don't know if Biden has said this specifically, but at least people around him have thought about the vice presidential candidate this time around sort of being the next step for the Democratic Party. I think that makes Harris make a lot of sense. And I think from a pure electoral map perspective, if you just go through all the possibilities, I think Baldwin makes a lot of sense. But really, you can make a reasonable case for, I think, almost any of these candidates.
Joel, you have this very interesting stat you've compiled which I shamelessly use for myself. So I appreciate that you found it. and that is that 15 of the last 18 Democratic vice presidential picks have been senators. And of course, many of the top choices this time also seem to be sitting members of the US Senate. Why do you think senators so often end up as the Democratic running mate, whereas on the Republican side, it seems like the choices are a little more varied? Paul Ryan was a sitting member of the House. Mike Pence was a governor. Dick Cheney wasn't a senator. Why do you think that is? Do you think that there's any actual reason for that?
Yeah, it's an interesting statistic. I'm not quite sure. I think it has to do with the nationalization of politics, in part the importance of foreign policy, but also the on the Democratic side, particularly with the party sort of having a sort of a New Deal, Great Society agenda. The Senate is a place where people can demonstrate that. I think it's also because, generally speaking, vice presidential candidates have a fair amount of experience in leading positions as senator, governor, high executive positioner in the House. If you're a senator, it's easier to sustain that sort of longevity than if you're a governor. I think that's one of the factors. I think it's interesting, even if you look on the Republican side, really a lot of the people who've been picked are people who had a lot of experience in national politics, either in the Senate, the House, or in the executive branch. And even some of the governors who've been picked, Governor Pence, I mean, had spent, a dozen years in the House. A number of the people who've been in the executive branch on the Republican side had been in the House. So I think that both the seniority, the ability to get experience, and the sort of the nationalization of politics is in part what's going on.
Julia, you were talking about kind of the ideology or the sort of ideological message that maybe a vice presidential choice can send, and you made it what I thought was a really interesting observation, just in noting that. So we're going to have whoever it ends up being is going to be the third woman chosen to be a major party vice presidential nominee, and that the first two, Geraldine Ferraro and Sarah Palin, they both actually were, kind of connoted or had this sort of ideological connotation to them. And I think you argued that both of them may have actually been sort of pulling the ticket in a more conservative direction. First of all, could you go into that a little bit? And then also, do you think that that might have any sort of bearing on how Biden might make this choice?
Yeah, there's a lot of complexity there. One of the things that you see when you look at the discourse around Geraldine Ferraro's selection as Walter Mondale's running mate in 1984 is about how she represented Archie Bunker's district in New York, and so drawing on a fictional character to represent this sort of conservative leaning kind of blue collar Democratic tradition. And for McCain and Palin, that story is probably a little more vivid in people's minds. That I think Palin was clearly a pick to try and engage movement conservatives, many of whom were suspicious of McCain's ideological commitment. I think that's not an accident. As I said, this fits in the established pattern in which both Democrats and Republicans pick running mates who tend to move the ticket to the right. But I think for women in these two moments, that is especially true. And there's research showing that people perceive women candidates to be more liberal. And so it makes sense that the first woman selected for a Democratic ticket was someone who actually didn't bring a kind of progressive sense to what was already a progressive candidate, but rather move the ticket to the right. I think the dynamics in 2020 are going to be different, because there is this sense that one of the constituencies to whom the Biden ticket needs to appeal is a progressive wing of the Democratic Party. So here I think I maybe am seeing the situation somewhat differently from David. I take the point about the Klobuchar selection and what she would bring to the ticket. And there's certainly something to be said for having a clear stance as a ticket, to saying, okay, this is, we are the center of the Democratic Party. We represent its tradition and what that tradition brings to the 21st century. At the same time, one of the things that strikes me about the 2016 and 2020 contests within the Democratic Party is that while the progressive left wasn't successful either time in winning the presidency, they have been successful in dominating the kind of conversational agenda. And much of what we heard in the debates was around critical kind of talking points of that constituency in the party on criminal justice reform, Medicare for all. And I don't know that this ticket will be able to avoid responding to those. And one way to respond is to have someone from that wing of the party or a little bit closer to it on the ballot.
David, if you want to respond to that, go ahead if you want.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a couple different ways to think about it. I think that makes sense. I think that's part of the case for maybe a Tammy Baldwin candidacy, someone who's from the progressive left who, may or may not have the same high profile as Sanders or Warren, but serves as a nod to that constituency. I think that's a fine way to do things. I don't know. I have no idea who Biden's going to pick. I think it makes sense that he's going to be feeling pulse in that direction from the progressive wing. I think he's also going to be feeling pulse in a direction to nominate a woman of color, sort of regardless of ideology. There's going to be some pull just to sort of win at all costs, right? That maybe this is a, break glass of in case of emergency type election. And the, Biden campaign may make the calculation that, the progressives are going to get on board regardless. Let's, not take any risks. Because there is also the risk of if Biden does pick, say, Elizabeth Warren or someone who is like a really well-known progressive, of that changing how voters view him and sort of having a knock-on effect. So I don't know. I guess my macro view of all this is that there's a lot of different ways to make the choice and a lot of different ones that kind of make sense from different perspectives. And I don't know. I don't have enough of an insight into sort of the collective Biden hive mind to know what category is going to prevail.
Yeah, Ted, go ahead.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add that last point David made is key, because I think the vice presidential selection is going to hinge on which block of voters the Biden campaign believes is going to deliver the White House. And so if they choose a Klobuchar or someone, that's a clear indicator they're looking for the moderate white working class voter, maybe the Obama-Trump crowd, to come back to the party tent. They go with a candidate of color, particularly an African-American one. They'd be looking to drive up Black turnout as the way to get the keys to the White House. Battleground state candidates that, looking to flip states. So no matter which route they go, the choice is going to signal, I think, which block of voters they think is most critical to winning back the White House. The other thing they have to consider is based on because there's no one candidate that checks both the battleground state, the driving up Black turnout, and winning back Obama-Trump white working class voters. You can't get someone who does all of those things. So you choose the one who you think will bring the block over that you need, but you also have to pay attention to who the candidate you choose turns off. And what we saw from the Obama presidency and in other races is that racial resentment, certainly in 2016, was a factor. And so a Black candidate may drive up Black turnout, a Black VP selection, but it may also cause those with high levels of racial resentment to not support Biden for whatever, or not turn out at all. Similarly, if you choose the sort of white woman from the Midwest, then Black voters or voters of color may see that as a slight given this opportunity, and maybe the turnout is depressed there. So I think this is really about which voters do you inspire, and based on that selection, which voters are you going to turn off? And based on the net gain, I think that will absolutely play into the calculations of what the ultimate selection, or who the ultimate selection will be.
I want to direct this question to Joel, but I want others to chime in if they'd like. And I think you've already some of you have already gotten into this a little bit, but there is a push and pull between how much the choice is designed to win the election versus how much the choice is designed to actually govern, if in fact you're fortunate enough to win the election. And Biden himself had kind of a way of looking at this. There was quoted recently, and he talked about there being kind of like an August choice, which was to get a lot of excitement. There was an October choice to get votes, or there was more of like a January choice for governing. Joel, I guess in your experience in looking at this, what do you think is important? And also, when most VP choices are made, is it more of an electoral choice, or is it more of a governing choice, or are those things sometimes the same thing?
Well, I think as you suggest there at the end, Kyle, that sometimes oftentimes it's the same. I think one of the things that's important is that I think really the threshold requirement in choosing a running mate, in addition to them passing sort of a rigorous vetting screen, is that they've got to be presidential, and they've got to be somebody who's perceived by reachable voters as being somebody who reachable voters could see sitting in the Oval Office. And so it's a mistake to choose somebody who isn't really ready to be president and isn't ready to step out on the campaign trail. And really with, forgive the sports metaphor, but with no spring training, with no sort of period to sort of ease into it, you've got to be ready to step out and perform on day one. And so I think, there have been instances where a vice presidential candidate looks really good at the rollout, and as August moves into November, they don't look nearly as good. When George W. Bush used to say that he chose Dick Cheney for governing, not for politics, and that he already had Wyoming's 3 electoral votes in the bag. But in fact, Cheney wasn't just a choice about governing. It was a choice about politics. It was a choice that sent a message that a governor of Texas with no national security experience was going to surround himself with people who had been in Washington, who had managed the Persian Gulf War successfully, and so forth. So oftentimes the choice about choosing somebody who's going to be effective in January is also about November as well.
Let me just jump in, sort of add another question on, and then others are welcome to jump in too. And this is a question we got for some readers, this idea that, Biden is certainly an older candidate, and there have been sort of questions about his performance on the trail, maybe his health, et cetera. And does that sort of make it more important for the choice to be someone who really can step in, as Joel said, sort of without spring training? Again, any of you could jump in on that if you'd like.
I mean,
Yeah, I'll go ahead.
Go ahead.
Julia, you first, and then.
Okay. I mean, I think it certainly increases the attention to that. I am unconvinced that traditional measures of experience necessarily tell us exactly what we need to know there. I think a lot of people in the space are really over-influenced by the Sarah Palin example and the shorthand of, well, she was not very experienced. But that actually wasn't really her problem. That was the start of the problem. But the extent of the problem was this kind of, she wasn't thinking like somebody involved in national politics. I think there are a lot of people who hold a lot of different positions who are probably ready to do that. But I do think that what it does is electorally, it opens up a line of attack. And so this further merges, is what Joel was saying, the electoral and the governing kind of imperatives in that regard.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree with that. And I mean, if we look, Trump obviously had zero federal or state, any sort of governing experience before being elected. And Barack Obama, frankly, had only been in the Senate for a couple of years before he was elected and then reelected. So I do think, but there was a sense of, with Obama, that he was smart, would surround himself with very smart people, very capable people. His VP selection reified that sense. And so I think because of Biden's experience, his judgment, I think people will judge his selection not just based on their electoral record or their governing record, but that if Biden is willing to trust this person to be second in command, I think that trust that he has in the person will sort of carry over to many of the voters. So I don't think that the electoral record is as important as just a general sense of, is the person capable of governing well?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Ted and Julia said. The one thing that I'll add, I don't have the number in front of me right now, but sometime in 2019, Pew did a survey of Democratic voters and asked them what the ideal age for a president was. And if I remember right, the massive number of Democrats said somewhere in the 40s or in the 50s. And they've nominated a candidate who's in his 70s. And so I think that, it would, if Biden picks someone who is, significantly younger than him and is convincing in terms of, being ready for the presidency, whatever that looks like in terms of experience or just general readiness when the electorate actually sees that person, I think that's going to be pretty important. And if not, I think that phrase line of attack, I think that Julia used is correct. I think that Trump would be able to have a lot of news cycles where, they just kind of hammer on, oh, is this person ready? Is this person not? And it becomes a thing when it doesn't have to if Biden has a bad pick.
Yeah, and Carl, if I could jump
Sure.
in, I think the way that Julia analyzed it is right on target. That having some experience sort of insulates you a little bit from attack, but and maybe it's a surrogate for it's one surrogate for ability, but it's certainly not a perfect surrogate for ability. And we've seen people who've served a long time that we'd want nowhere near the Oval Office. And Ted gave the good example of President Obama as somebody who came with little experience. Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt are other examples. One difference with the Obama situation is that he'd gone through the primaries and defeated Hillary Clinton through a really rigorous, and so you had a sense that this was somebody who was really special and could really handle himself. One of the challenges in picking a running mate is to try and figure out which of these people really are star quality type people who can really step out there and really, handle themselves without missing a beat. And that's, I think, really one of the challenges that you don't have in the same way that with President Obama, you could really see it from how he did in a really tough primary.
I want to take a little bit of a detour from the Democratic choice and maybe just talk a little bit about the Trump-Pence ticket. Not to toot my own horn, but I wrote something about this today. The idea that history certainly suggests, and the president's own public comments suggest that Mike Pence is going to remain the running mate in 2020. But hypothetically, Trump could make a different selection if he felt if he wanted to. I wanted to ask each of you, and again, if the simple answer is one word or two words, no way, that's not going to happen. Do any of you think that there's a real possibility that Trump might swap out his running mate? And of course, Nikki Haley's name, I guess, is the one that's really come up as a person that might run with him. So, Julia, maybe I could direct that to you first.
Sure. So I stopped saying that won't happen in 2016, and I don't say that anymore. But I think it's unlikely. I mean, I think Pence was a pretty astute pick for Trump in 2016 from a strategic perspective. And he's appealed to the constituency he was chosen to appeal to. He's been a very visible part of the administration's fight against coronavirus, and that may not be broadly appealing because that's been pretty unpopular, but it may actually be, again, a kind of targeted appeal that works fine. The only scenario in which I can really see changing up the ticket is if Trump gets it into his head that this is a way to get a lot of press, and it would be. I mean, I know I would write about it. So maybe, but that's really, I don't see it as a decision that has an obvious political calculus behind it, other than this very distinctly Trumpian one.
Ted?
Yeah, I think it's highly unlikely. I don't think it'll happen. We'll see. I do think Julia's right that if there's a sense that Trump believes that this will sort of skyrocket his press coverage and shine the spotlight on him, especially coming out of the Democratic National Convention, or maybe going into it, depending on how the dates match up anymore. Maybe. The thing that's the little monkey wrench I'd like to throw in is, let's say he does. And like you mentioned, a lot of the talk has been Nikki Haley would help him do better with women, maybe with voters of color. I think another South Carolinian would be the better choice. And I think it would be Tim Scott if he were to move Pence out. For a few reasons. One would, especially if Biden chooses not to go with a Black woman, and Trump has sort of, with his Black Voices for Trump and the Blexit stuff, they're making these sort of symbolic plays for Black voters. But one thing is true, in the 2016 election, Trump won something like 1 in 7 Black men. And my research has shown that Black men prioritize race of a candidate almost over any other quality because of that sense of connection, even more than gender. Black men's sexism will be muted for a Black woman because of the racial identity or connection. So if Trump were to have a Black man, and Tim Scott's been a pretty faithful Republican since he's been in office, but even under Trump, then maybe Trump may not improve on that 1 in 7. He may hold steady there with Black men, but he probably gets some Black men not to show up. And if that happens in the right places, then that could swing a state or two. So that would be, and to talk about historic, at a time when the Democrats had a chance to choose a woman of color, and if they were to pass on that chance and Trump seizes it, that would make history. It would take all the oxygen out of the room for the racist claims about the president, whether true or not, and then may have an electoral effect on a small segment of voters that could flip a few cities and maybe states.
David?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Ted and Julia have said. The one thing that I'd sort of emphasize / add is that I think that when Trump has these personal decisions, loyalty seems to play a large part in his psyche, insofar that anyone can really see that. I was actually thinking about, I didn't think they were related at the time, but yesterday I was thinking about the Alabama Republican Senate primary runoff, where Jeff Sessions, Trump's former attorney general, is running against Tommy, is it Tuberville or Tuberville? I always forget. Tuberville, right. Tommy Tuberville.
A lot of college football.
Yeah. The former Auburn head coach. And Trump, if I recall, endorsed Tuberville, and Sessions, because he recused himself, is sort of on Trump's negative list, despite Sessions arguably being sort of a pre-Trump Trumpist figure, maybe an architect of whatever ideological Trumpism sort of is. Anyways, that whole story, the point of that is that it seems like for Trump himself, loyalty and connection matters, and that seems like a point in favor of Pence staying on the ticket.
Joel, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, Carl, I thought it was an awfully good piece that you wrote this morning. I think what the others have said, I basically agree with. The only thing I would add is that one of the things that generally makes it difficult to drop a running mate is that the vice president, after 4 years, has done a lot of party work. He typically has a constituency in the party. You don't want to alienate part of your base, and that's the risk that you run. If, on the other hand, you're a president who thinks that if you shot somebody on Fifth Avenue, that your supporters would stick with you, you may be less inclined to be worried about alienating some of your base than others. President Trump has been willing to break other norms more than other presidents, so maybe he will this time too. I doubt it, but I think it's more possible than with others. Ted makes the important point that Trump gets to go last, so he could respond to the Democratic selection. The other thing, if you really want to get sort of deep and dark about all of this, is that if you're President Trump and you're at all concerned about the possibility that you might want to, at some point, ask your vice president to step in and pardon you if the election doesn't go the way that you want it to, you may be adverse to alienating him at this point by dropping him from the ticket, which would make asking for a pardon a little bit less likely.
Let me move back to the Democrats. And Julie, I'll direct this one to you first, but this is another one that if others want to chime in, feel free to. And that is that I guess Stacey Abrams has been sort of the poster person for this, although there have been other Democrats like this. It feels like she's almost like campaigning for the VP slot, and quite publicly so. But I think others have suggested that they would be very interested in the job. Is what Abrams and others are doing, is that unusual historically? What do you think about that, about being very kind of publicly open about wanting the job.
I think it's a little bit less unusual than what some of the critics would lead us to believe. I think in general, these people who've been vice presidents in the modern era have been astute and ambitious politicians, and they have done things either publicly or behind the scenes to to make that happen for themselves. And so our notion that somehow politics only became political this year, this is like a never-ending myth in American politics. And I think it's actually very telling that this is the kind of norm that we say it's a norm only to observe the ways in which it's being violated, right? And so it's kind of always in tension with itself. And it's very telling that it's Stacey Abrams who's, I think, drawing that fire for being overly ambitious and violating this long-standing norm in really that goes beyond vice presidential politics and into like back in the day presidential politics. You weren't supposed to be too ambitious or pursue the office. And again, that norm was always kind of there, there in violation. And I just think, now that we have a younger African-American woman who's making public that she would be interested in the vice presidency, she thinks she's qualified, she thinks she would add something to the ticket, and she's doing that in the idiom of contemporary politics. So it's very media facing, it's very public. That's, that to me, I smell something a little fishy about the way that some people have responded to that.
Ted, you're nodding your head.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the fact that Stacey Abrams from Georgia, natural hair, Black woman, no statewide office. I mean, like there's a number of reasons why she's getting special attention on this question, even though, as Julia mentioned, campaigning for the presidency, usually within party, the vein of the party is normal. She's getting extra attention for this reason. But the norm-breaking piece. Remember, Ted Cruz in 2016, looking like he was about to lose to Trump, which he did. He threw a Hail Mary and made Carly Fiorina his vice presidential selection before the primaries were even over, and that was norm busting. So the idea of breaking a norm to help as a means of political advantage happens every time there's a presidential election. But I think the attention that Abrams is getting is absolutely not a function just of the fact that she's breaking a supposed norm, but of who she is, what she looks like, what her experiences are, and without a doubt that plays a factor in it.
David or Joel, do you want to weigh in on the how aggressively someone is pursuing the office question?
I mean, my only just short thought on this is that, some of the discourse around Abrams pursuing this seems a little fishy as well to me. The comparison that comes up in my head immediately is Beto O'Rourke. So Beto O'Rourke runs for president in 2020 with about exactly as much qualification as Stacey Abrams, and people are like, oh, this is interesting, young, yeah. Stacey Abrams goes out and says like, oh, I, would like to be vice president, and there are many furrowed brows. And so, yeah, I think that's kind of a, it's not a great phenomenon, but I don't see any issue with it. I mean, if I remember right, she says she wants to be president by 2040, and being Biden's vice president is a quick route to that.
Kyle, I think that is Julia says, running for vice president is certainly not anything new. Many people who've made it. Dan Quayle, ran a careful campaign to be vice president. Many others did. It's usually done more sort of covertly behind the scenes. One of the structural changes that's happened is the whole advent of vetting. I mean, nowadays, if you submit to the vetting, it's pretty obvious that you want to be vice president, because nobody in the right mind would turn over everything about their life to a group of people. And I mean, it's a time-consuming process. It's intrusive, and it's exhausting. You wouldn't do it unless you wanted to be vice president. So I think some of what's going on here also has a little bit to do with where you are or where you perceive to be in the pecking order. I think the people who might be perceived to be closer to the top of the ranking list are being a little bit less overt than maybe some of the people further down. But on the other hand, I think there's also just an aspect that people are being more candid and more open with their aspirations, and I think that's probably a good thing.
David, I want to direct this one to you. One question that we've got a lot of different questions about this, about different candidates, but in your assessment of the field, and particularly the senators, there's a possibility that if you become the vice president, that the Senate, you could lose the Senate seat. Of the many Democratic senators being mentioned, who are the ones that really stand out as being risky in the sense of risking a Senate seat? Because, there are a lot of plausible scenarios in which the Senate could really be exactly 50-50 next year. So as you've looked at it, sort of put your electoral hat on, which ones are risky in that regard?
Yeah, it's kind of this interesting balance, right? If you think of it from an electoral perspective, vice presidential candidates can sometimes have, depending on the different method you use, either 0 to small sort of boost in their home states. So if you were to pick a vice presidential candidate who's from a swing state in the hopes that they would help you, like say Biden were to pick a Whitmer or a Klobuchar or a Baldwin, then at least for Baldwin or Klobuchar, that Senate seat would also be up. So getting sort of that potential bonus, depending on how things turn out, is also potentially costing you by opening a vacancy in a vulnerable seat. And I do think that some of these seats would be vulnerable. We know from past history that essentially when one party takes the White House, typically the other party's stock starts to rise relatively quickly. It's one of the many reasons that Democrats won a Senate election in Alabama. It's why they did so well in special elections. It's what happened in the 2018 midterms. There's kind of this action-reaction thing happening. So I think that makes, that introduces risks for someone like Baldwin. It introduces risks for someone like Klobuchar, that Senate seat would be gone. And it really depends on how Biden weighs those risks. I mean, he could pick, sort of senator who's from a relatively safe seat. If he picks Duckworth or if he picks Harris, Democrats are probably going to be fine. But if he does that and then loses the election by losing Wisconsin by a tiny margin, he'll probably be kicking himself.
Got an interesting question here. I think I'll direct it to Julia, and then if others want to chime in, they're welcome to. And this is from Gary Burfoot. Well, I know it's highly unlikely. Do you think it would be a good idea for Biden to run as a fusion candidate and pick a Republican? He floats Condoleezza Rice as his running mate as an effort to end or slightly diminish our brutal partisanship. And to be fair, I think Biden did actually float the possibility of a Republican running mate, although I think it kind of died as soon as he said it. So, Julia, what do you think about that?
Yeah, this is everyone's other favorite election myth. Like, you can almost set your watch to the stories. We're going to get the contested convention one is going to happen soon again, right? And then we get the unity ticket. Yeah, I mean, I guess the criterion we would use for, is this a good idea? Would it help Biden win? And I'm not really sure that this voter who's really craving bipartisan unity is really a person right now. I mean, maybe in theory that's a thing, or that's something. If you ask people, do you want bipartisan unity or do you want lots of fighting, most people are going to say, oh, I want some bipartisanship. But then the devil, as usual, is in the details and in the practice. So who would be that Republican, right? That's the real question, and I could speculate about that, but maybe others have some ideas. I just don't think that would really do anything to help send the message that Biden would need to send to consolidate party support. And the way you win elections is to consolidate party support and then build out that coalition, not the other way around. It seems like those pieces should be interchangeable, but I think maybe they're not. I guess the other thing I would add to that is that our famous example of a unity ticket from America's past is Abraham Lincoln picking Andrew Johnson. So that can go pretty far awry.
Yeah, and I would add that McCain thought about doing this in '08 and choosing Lieberman as his VP. And, who knows what '08 turns out to be if he chooses Lieberman over Palin. But the world is very different today than it was in 2008. And so what Biden, I think part of his appeal is that he sort of harkens back to that era of guys in the cloakroom sort of smacking each other on the back before they trash each other on the floor, but really being friends. Like, those days are done. It's just, I mean, that is part of the nostalgia of America that Trump tapped into. There's just not a foothold for it anymore. And so I think it would be a bad call in this election particularly, to choose a Republican running mate when, one, you've got a number of qualified Dems. And you've got to think about, if Biden is the gasp of breath from the old Democratic Party, you're not turning it over to anyone in the new Democratic Party by choosing a vice presidential candidate who's a Republican. So I don't see it happening, and I don't think it would be a good idea either.
Joel, you've written that this is a classic, and Julie, you suggested this too. This is kind of classic myth or frequent storyline of the VP search, this sort of bipartisan ticket idea.
Yeah, I mean, and it comes up every so often. I mean, the other instance where I think it was really seriously considered was John Kerry. I mean, really, I think did seriously pursue John McCain in 2004, and McCain initially sent some signals that he might be receptive to it, and then backed away. But I think for all the reasons said, it's sort of a recurring storyline, but it's not going to happen.
I thought this was an interesting question from David Bougopoulos. And do you think that Biden has any regrets in saying that he certainly was going to choose a woman for this job, in that, yes, there are a lot of women he can choose from, but it also rules out a lot of men he could have chosen? Do you think that he, that maybe he unnecessarily limited his field of options? If anyone, David, I'll throw that to you. And
yeah, I think this was. I don't think Biden did anything that would hurt him by pledging to pick a woman. There's, like we've talked about, a number of different qualified candidates, some of whom we talked about panel, some of whom we haven't. We haven't got through the whole list, and we've been talking for 45 minutes or however long. I think that it was a good move to time it that way, in the way that he did. It seemed like during that sort of phase of the primary where Biden made that commitment, he was sort of mid-ascent, if you will, where the Democratic Party was kind of starting to think, oh, this is our presumptive nominee. And I think that was him sort of having a nod towards the idea that diversity is important in the Democratic Party, and that it's a party where most of the voters are women. And so to me, I don't think that he ruled out any. I think he has tons of great picks. I don't think there's some shining star who is a man who's the perfect pick or something like that that's now out of reach. I think it's totally fine for the Biden campaign.
Can I jump in on that?
Sure.
I think strategically it was a smart way to dominate the news coverage of that debate, which happened just as the country was shutting down in the coronavirus situation. So I think that was really smart. I wish that it had been an opportunity for Biden to better explain the logic behind such a pick, as not just, not leaving it up to people's imaginations, and not just, a woman will bring different things by virtue of being a woman, or make it look like a campaign gimmick, but really to say, presidential politics has really only drawn from one segment of the population, and we've missed a lot of great talent. One way to do that is to consider picking a woman. Obviously, that's not the only factor, but I wish there had been a moment where he could have unpacked that logic of diversity, so it seemed less like, oh, we're going to pick a woman just for the sake of it, and make it, less reductive in that way.
I absolutely agree with that, because I can hear the Republican attack ads now calling this a quota pick or an affirmative action pick, and he sort of declared he was going to choose someone of a certain sex before he'd even considered candidates. And I think Julie is absolutely right. If he had explained the rationale for the choice, he could have headed some of those coming attacks off at the pass.
We're running a little low on time here, but I wanted to get to a few more questions. I'm going to address this one to Joel, but again, others can jump in if they want. Do we think that the public health crisis has any bearing on who Biden might choose? Would he have maybe considering different things if this wasn't the dominant storyline? And I guess that also ties to, we talked about how there have been so many senators picked as Democratic running mates. Some of the governors now, I specifically think of Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan, certainly has a bigger platform than she had before. So what do we think about the governors and also just the public health crisis in general, maybe having some sort of impact on who Biden might choose?
Well, I think it can in a couple of different ways. One is that, the reasons that presidential candidates typically wait until a little before the convention to make the choice is to sort of let the context clarify as much as it can. And we really don't know what the context of the election is going to be in November, and we don't know what the context is going to be in July and August. But clearly COVID-19 is going to be a big part of it, and trying to figure out what that part of it will be is part of what I'm sure that they're trying to figure out. Somebody like Governor Whitmer, as you say, Kyle, certainly has a platform where she's in a position to demonstrate leadership in a way that many others aren't, because she's the governor of an important state. I think the other thing that has to be challenging is that the campaign is likely to be very different in 2020 than it's been in all the other times that we've experienced. And so how will people campaign in 2020? What are the campaign skills that you'll be looking for? What will a vice presidential rollout look like? I think all of these are going to be different than what they were in 2016 or 2012 or in 1984 when Geraldine Ferraro was picked and so forth. And I think that's going to be one of the challenges for the Biden campaign, is trying to figure out exactly what those differences will be and how that affects the choice.
Anyone else on the coronavirus impact on the selection potentially?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it'll be, if it does have impacts, it'll be less on the public health piece of it and more on how to rebuild an economy that's been, devastated by the virus and its impacts. So if this were a national security issue, I think Biden feels pretty confident in his national security credentials, where he feels like he could represent that. But on an economic standpoint, or on that front, that may help or hurt Warren more based on what Americans think the new economy is going to look like post-COVID. And so I think, I don't know if that's a 1% consideration or 55%, but I think the economic impact will be the predominant factor in how the nation responds to COVID and its intersection with the VP selection.
David?
Yeah, just, small comment there, is that I think there's just a big cloud of uncertainty around what's going to happen with the virus in the next couple of months. Right now, governors have their approval ratings sort of skyrocketing due to, people approving of their handling of the virus and so on and so forth. But I think that it would be there is a risk, I think, to picking a governor, because who knows what happens in the next couple of months? Who knows how the public is going to process it? It may just be safer to pick a senator who's not a direct executive in charge of handling it and not have the potential downside risk of things going poorly in Michigan or wherever.
I said I wasn't going to do this in advance, but you actually don't have to answer the question. We've only got a minute left, but a lot of people are asking, hey, who do you think is going to be chosen? Again, I think only Biden himself knows, and maybe he doesn't know. I will say my own sense, and so I'm willing to put my neck on the line here, is I kind of think Klobuchar seems to make a lot of sense to me. And also I feel like when Klobuchar endorsed Biden, there was like a Freudian slip where she said she was joining the ticket and she had to take that back. So I'm seeing a conspiracy there. But if you want to, do any of you have a sense as to who you might think is the likeliest to be chosen? Again, if you don't feel like offering an opinion, that's totally fine.
I have no
I'll jump in.
Okay, go ahead. Be brave.
The Brennan Center is a nonpartisan organization. We don't support any candidates of either party, but strictly from putting on my political scientist hat. I think the biggest advantage would be a Harris selection in terms of who turns out, the efficiency of, if you increase Black turnout, 9 of those 10 votes, or 9 of every 10 votes you increase are going to go to to Biden. And so that would be my my political science calculus guess. I have no clue of what the campaign's thinking or if they'd agree.
With that, we've hit 1 o'clock. I really want to thank our panelists, Joe Goldstein, Ted Johnson, David Byler, Julie Azari. I had a great time doing this, and thank you for joining us. And again, if you follow this stuff, please subscribe to the Crystal Ball, centerforpolitics.org/Crystal Ball. And thanks for watching.